Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Poirot's darkest secret, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Case Poirot Refused to Solve. The rain pounded against the cobblestone streets of London, turning them into rivers of flickering light beneath the gas lamps. It was the kind of night where secrets felt heavier, where shadows stretched longer than they should. Inside a quiet apartment on Florentin Street, the telephone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the silence. Poirot sat motionless, his hands steepled, his mind already restless before he even reached for the receiver. A voice on the other end, breathless, shaken, terrified. "Monsieur Poirot, they are going to kill me." Poirot straightened, his grip tightening on the phone. "Who, mon ami?" A pause, then barely a whisper. "I know what they did. I know what you did." And then, a click. The line went dead. For a long moment, Poirot did not move. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the air felt colder than it should. A case had just found him, uninvited, a mystery waiting to be solved. And yet, for the first time in his long career, Poirot felt something strange curling in his chest. Not intrigue, not determination, something closer to fear. He let the receiver rest gently back in its cradle. He did not call the police. He did not ask questions. He did nothing at all, because this was a case he could never take. The next morning, Arthur Lytton was found dead, slumped over his desk, a single bullet wound in his temple. The door locked. From the inside, no sign of forced entry. The papers on his desk were scattered, his typewriter still holding the last sentence he had written. Poirot stood over the body, his expression unreadable as he scanned the unfinished words on the page. "They think the past is buried, that no one remembers, but I do, and soon the world will know the truth about—" The sentence stopped there, cut short by death itself. The ink was smudged, where blood had soaked into the paper. A warning left unfinished, a truth silenced before it could be spoken. Poirot exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over his shoulders. He should have answered sooner. The investigation led him to the grand estate of Lord Henry Bancroft, where Arthur had been last seen alive. The house stood like a monument to power, its towering columns and gilded halls whispering of wealth, of influence, of things hidden behind closed doors. Inside, 5 people waited, their faces carefully composed, their secrets tightly guarded. Lord Henry Bancroft, the politician with a perfect reputation, though whispers of scandal trailed behind him like a shadow. Evelyn Bancroft, his wife, her elegance unmarred by grief, but something flickering beneath her calm facade. Daniel Harrington, the journalist, Arthur's closest friend, whose hands trembled when Poirot questioned him. Margaret Fay, the loyal secretary, whose eyes darted too quickly when asked about Arthur's work. And Inspector Renaud, the man leading the case, an old ally of Poirot's, a man who, for reasons Poirot could not yet name, felt slightly off. Each of them had an alibi. Each of them had something to lose. And somewhere among them, the killer stood, waiting. Poirot sat alone that evening, the rain still falling against his window. His thoughts circled the crime, the way a predator stalks its prey, and then a knock at his door. A messenger, drenched from the storm, holding a single envelope. No name, no return address, just a single sheet of paper inside. Arthur Litton's handwriting, and one line scrawled across the page. You know why you refuse this case, because the truth begins with you. Poirot's breath hitched. The room felt smaller, the shadows stretched deeper, and suddenly, for the first time in his life, he felt as though he were not the hunter, but the hunted. At dawn, Poirot returned to the crime scene, something gnawing at the edges of his mind. He traced his fingers over the typewriter, the ink-stained page. He leaned closer. The ink was too fresh, too new. A realization struck him like lightning. The letter had been typed after Arthur had died, a cover-up, a deception, a murder that had never happened the way it was meant to be believed. Arthur had not been shot in his study. His body had been placed there, the crime staged to mislead. And then, a second revelation. Arthur had never been shot. No bullet wound, no sign of trauma. Poirot's heart pounded. Arthur had been dead for days, which meant everything had been a performance. The cover-up, the staged crime scene, the misplaced clues. Only one person had the power to manipulate it all. Poirot turned slowly, his gaze locking on to Inspector Renaud. You, Poirot whispered. Renaud smiled, a slow, knowing smile. You were never supposed to find out. Poirot took a step forward, his voice low, sharp. You staged it all. You killed Arthur somewhere else. You faked the gunshot. You typed the letter. You wanted me to believe that Arthur had died trying to expose Bancroft? Renaud laughed softly. Yes, that was the game, old friend. Silence fell between them, thick, heavy. Poirot's mind raced. Why? Renaud's smirk faded, his voice dropped, his eyes dark. Because Arthur wasn't trying to expose Bancroft. A pause, a breath. He was trying to expose you. Poirot froze. The storm outside felt deafening now, a roaring wind pressing against the glass. His fingers trembled. His thoughts reeled. What had Arthur found? What truth had he uncovered? And why? Why was Poirot suddenly afraid to solve this case? He looked down at the letter in his hands. You know why you refuse this case. Because the truth begins with you. And for the first time in his life, Poirot felt something he never thought possible. Doubt. For the first time in his life. Poirot wasn't sure if he was the detective in this story, or the villain. Chapter 2. A murder he tried to bury. The past has a way of clawing back to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. Poirot knew this better than anyone. But some ghosts do not whisper. They scream. It started with a letter. No return address, no name, just 4 words, written in a trembling hand. You forgot one, Poirot. He turned the paper over. Nothing. No sender. No clue. Only those 4 words. A warning. A threat. Or something far worse. A reminder. That night, he could not sleep. His mind reeled, flipping through old cases, old crimes. Poirot never forgot a murder. Never left a mystery unsolved. And yet, as he sat in the dim glow of his study, he felt something he had never felt before. A creeping doubt. A whisper of something unfinished. At dawn, the police uncovered a body. It had been buried in the gardens of Blackwood Manor, deep beneath the old rose bushes. Decayed, forgotten. And yet, when they unearthed the remains, something sent a cold wave of dread through Poirot's veins. The body was nearly skeletal, but the fingers were still curled in a death grip around a single object, a pocket watch, engraved with Poirot's own initials. The breath left his lungs. The world tilted slightly. He stared at the watch, the polished surface smeared with dirt, the hands frozen in time. 10:13 p.m. A specific hour, a specific moment. But of what? And why? Why was his name on the only piece of evidence found with the corpse? The investigation led him to Blackwood Manor, a place long abandoned, its halls whispering with the echoes of a family that had once thrived, and then vanished. The house had changed hands, but the past still clung to it, seeping through the walls like something rotten. There were 3 people who had once lived here, 3 who knew the truth of what had happened beneath the soil. Lord Thomas Blackwood, the last heir of the estate, had returned to London after years abroad. He claimed ignorance, said he had no knowledge of any crime, yet his hands never stopped shaking. Evelyn Blackwood, his sister, stood in the drawing room, her face pale, her voice brittle as glass. "We don't speak of the past, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered. "The past should remain where it is." But it was the third person who unsettled Poirot most, Dr. Charles Willoughby, the family physician, the one who had been closest to them all, a man who had signed every death certificate for the Blackwood family, and yet something about his presence felt wrong. His eyes lingered too long, his answers were too measured. And when Poirot mentioned the time on the watch, 10:13 p.m., Dr. Willoughby flinched. The body in the garden had been there for 10 years. The cause of death? Blunt force trauma, a killing done in rage. But there was something stranger still. The bones showed signs of post-mortem fractures. Someone had disturbed the body years after death. Someone had dug it up and then reburied it. Poirot felt the weight of the letter in his pocket. You forgot one. Who was the victim? Why had their death been erased? And why was he, Poirot himself, linked to a crime he had never investigated? Then, the final piece fell into place. At exactly 10:13 p.m., 10 years ago, Poirot had been in this very house, a guest, a visitor. He had been investigating a different crime, a different murder. That night, the Blackwood family had insisted he leave before midnight. They had hurried him out, their smiles forced, their goodbyes rushed, because, on that same night, someone else had died, and Poirot had never known. He inhaled sharply, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned to Dr. Willoughby. "Tell me," he said quietly, "who did I walk past that night? Who was already dead while I stood here, asking questions?" The doctor's lips trembled, his face drained of color. He looked at the pocket watch in Poirot's hand, and for a moment, just a moment, his mask cracked. And then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. A crash, rush of footsteps. By the time the lanterns flickered back on, Dr. Willoughby was gone. The truth was slipping through Poirot's fingers, but one thing was clear. This was a murder someone had tried to bury, and tonight they would kill again to keep it that way. Chapter 3. The Letter That Shouldn't Exist. The envelope was old, too old. The edges yellowed with time, the ink faded, but still legible. It had been sealed, untouched for decades, yet here it was, resting in Poirot's hands as if time itself had played a cruel trick. He ran his fingers over the wax seal, unbroken. Whoever had sent this letter had never intended for it to be opened, and yet it had arrived at his door. No return address, no explanation. Only his name scrawled across the front in a familiar hand. A hand that should not exist, because the sender was dead. His pulse quickened as he broke the seal, carefully unfolding the fragile paper. The words inside sent a cold shiver down his spine. Poirot, if you are reading this, it means I have failed. It means they got to me before I could stop them. It means you are already in danger. A date was written at the top, March 5th, 1914. Poirot's breath hitched. That was 25 years ago. His eyes moved to the bottom of the page, to the signature written in trembling strokes. Arthur Hastings, a heartbeat of silence, a weight settling in his chest, like lead. Hastings had died 6 years ago, and yet this letter, this impossible, maddening letter, had arrived just last night. The ink was old, but not as old as it should have been. The paper worn, but not fragile enough to have existed for 25 years. The wax seal unbroken until today. Something was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. Poirot forced himself to read the letter again. Each word, each line, a warning from the past, yet fresh with urgency. Hastings had written this letter knowing it would never reach him in time. But how? And why had it appeared now, so many years later? The final line sent a cold chill down his spine. Find the woman in black. She knows the truth. But beware, Poirot. She knows yours too. His grip tightened. The room around him suddenly felt too small, too quiet. The weight of a presence unseen, pressing in on him. A knock at the door made him flinch, slow, measured, deliberate. He hesitated, then rose, crossing the dimly lit room. With careful precision, he opened the door, only to find no one there. Just the whisper of the wind through the empty corridor. And another envelope. This one new. Poirot picked it up, turning it over with careful hands. The seal was identical to the first, the handwriting the same. But this time, there was no date, and when he opened it, the message was shorter, more chilling. You should have left the past buried. Poirot stared at the words, his heartbeat steady but heavy. Someone had known this letter would arrive. Someone had been watching. And now, someone wanted him to stop looking. But it was already too late, because Poirot had never ignored a mystery. And this time, the mystery had found him first. By nightfall, he was on his way to Ravenshade Manor, the last known residence of Arthur Hastings before his death. A place long abandoned, its walls holding secrets no one dared speak of. The locals whispered that it was cursed, that no one who entered left the same. Poirot did not believe in curses, but he believed in fear. The manor loomed before him, its windows dark, its gates rusted shut. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the weight of something unseen. As he stepped inside, the first thing he noticed was the dust, undisturbed. No footprints, no sign of visitors. And yet, on the grand piano in the center of the room, a fresh glass of wine. Red, unfinished, still warm. He was not alone. A shadow moved in the hallway. Soft, deliberate steps. Poirot's breath slowed. He turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of fabric disappearing around the corner. A woman, wearing black. The moment she saw him, she ran. Poirot followed, his steps quick, precise, weaving through the dark corridors of the forgotten house. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, something like blood. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. Poirot stepped inside cautiously. And there, in the center of the room, was a third letter, waiting for him. The envelope bore his name, the seal identical to the first two. His hands were steady as he opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper. This time, the message was different. You are the reason he is dead. A silence so thick it threatened to crush him, the weight of a truth unspoken, pressing against his ribs. A whisper from the doorway. He turned sharply. The woman in black stood there, half hidden in the shadows, her face unreadable. Her voice was soft, but her words shattered everything. You killed Hastings, Poirot. A single heartbeat, a truth that should not exist. And yet, it did. Chapter 4. A clue that changes everything. The rain had not stopped for days. It beat against the windows of Poirot's study in relentless rhythm, as if demanding to be let inside. The letter from the woman in black still sat on his desk, untouched since the night she vanished. Her words haunted him. You killed Hastings. A lie, a manipulation. It had to be. And yet doubt crept in like a slow-moving poison, infecting every thought, every memory. Poirot had spent years uncovering the truth in the darkest corners of human nature. But now, for the first time, the case was not about someone else. It was about him. And he did not know if he was ready for the answer. A knock at the door. Software. Hesitant. Poirot turned, his mind still clouded. When he opened it, he found Inspector Renaud, standing in the dimly lit hallway. His face was grave, his coat still dripping from the storm outside. He said nothing at first, just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. We found this, Renaud said, at Ravenshade Manor, in a room that had been locked for years. Poirot's fingers hesitated before taking it. The paper was old, fragile. When he unsealed it, a single object fell into his hand. A key. Small, tarnished with age, and yet unmistakable. Poirot knew this key. His breath came slower now, his pulse steady but heavy. He had held this key before, long ago, in a case he had closed. A case that, as far as he knew, had never been reopened. A case where the killer had been found, where the evidence had been clear. A case where the guilty had paid the price. Except now, this key had appeared. Now, this case was back. Poirot set the envelope aside. His voice was careful, controlled. Where does it belong? Renaud hesitated. The Blackwood Asylum. The words settled in the air like lead. Blackwood Asylum. A place of whispered horrors. A place meant to hold the minds that had long since unraveled. A place that Poirot had never visited. And yet somehow he held its key in his hands. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. By the time Poirot arrived at the asylum, the storm had worsened. The gates stood tall, rusted and unwelcoming. The air smelled of damp stone and something older, something forgotten. The nurse who greeted him was thin, tired, her voice hushed as she led him through the dim corridors. Poirot's steps were light, but his mind was heavy. He had not been here before. He was certain of it. But as they turned the final corner, something made his breath catch. A door, locked, dusty, untouched for years. The plaque on the outside bore a name, Poirot's own name. A slow, crawling dread settled in his bones. He turned to the nurse, but she was already stepping away. We never opened it, she murmured. Not after you left him here. Poirot's throat went dry. Left who? His fingers closed around the key. He turned it in the lock. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was stale, the scent of paper and time pressing against him. The room was small, nothing more than a desk, a single chair, and a filing cabinet covered in dust. And yet, as Poirot stepped forward, something on the desk made his knees go weak. A case file, and a single photograph. His hands trembled as he picked it up. Arthur Hastings. The image was old, but the face was unmistakable. Yet it was not the Hastings he remembered. No sharp military uniform, no warm, trusting smile. Instead, his eyes were hollow, vacant. The photograph was labeled with 2 words: patient, record. Poirot's breath shuddered. He turned the page, and there, written in neat, precise letters, was a name. The name of the man who had signed off on Hastings's institutionalization, Hercule Poirot. The room spun. The storm outside grew louder. This was a lie. It had to be. A trick. A fabrication. Hastings had died 6 years ago. A heart attack. There had been a funeral. Poirot had been there, hadn't he? The words blurred on the page. The details of Hastings's admittance. The diagnosis. The treatment. The final entry. Patient experienced severe delusions. Believed he had uncovered a conspiracy involving his closest companion. Repeatedly insisted that his friend was not who he claimed to be. Patient deemed unstable. Non-responsive to treatment. Case closed. Poirot swallowed hard. This could not be real. Hastings had never been here. Had he? The final note at the bottom of the page made his entire body go still. Patient found deceased in his cell. Cause of death. Unknown. Signed. By... Poirot's name was written at the bottom. But the signature was not his. The key slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a soft, metallic ring. The past had returned. The case he thought he had closed had just been reopened. And this clue, this one impossible clue, had changed everything. Chapter 5. The Witness Who Knew Too Much. The telephone rang at precisely 2:17 a.m. A sharp, shrill sound that cut through the heavy silence of the night. Poirot sat up instantly, his instincts sharper than sleep. He reached for the receiver, his fingers steady, but somewhere deep inside, something already felt wrong. A voice whispered on the other end, shaky, panicked, a man on the edge of terror. "Monsieur Poirot, I saw it. I saw who killed him." Poirot's breath stilled. "Who is this?" No, I saw. They are coming for me. Please." A sudden thud, a crash, and then silence. Poirot tightened his grip on the phone. "Allô? Monsieur, are you there?" Nothing. Just the faintest sound of breathing. But not from the man who had called. Someone else. Someone listening. And then the line went dead. The next morning, the newspapers reported the brutal murder of Simon Wren. A man who had seen something he never should have. A man who had called Poirot for help. And now, a man who was silenced forever. Poirot stood over the crime scene, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The small apartment was in chaos. A broken lamp, a shattered glass of whiskey, blood trailing from the desk to the floor, where Simon Wren's body lay twisted, his face still frozen in fear. But there was something strange, something missing. The murder weapon. No gun, no knife, no sign of how he had been killed. And yet, he was dead. Poirot knelt beside the body, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of the desk where the telephone had fallen, the last call Simon had made, the last plea he had spoken. And then, his fingers stopped. A single piece of paper, half crumpled beneath the desk. He unfolded it carefully. Just 2 words. "Ask Eleanor." Poirot's mind turned sharply. He knew an Eleanor, but there was no reason, no possible connection to this crime. And yet, the dead man's last message had led him to her. Lady Eleanor Fairfax, a widow, a philanthropist, a woman whose name was synonymous with wealth and respectability, but also a woman with a past she had buried deep. That afternoon, Poirot arrived at Fairfax Manor. The estate loomed over the hills, untouched by time, but as Poirot walked through the grand halls, something gnawed at him. The silence here was not ordinary. It was constructed, as if the house itself was waiting for something to happen. Lady Eleanor greeted him in the drawing-room, her face a mask of quiet composure. "Monsieur Poirot, what an unexpected visit." Poirot held up the crumpled note. "Do you know a man named Simon Wren?" A flicker, brief, but there. "I'm afraid I do not." "That is unfortunate," Poirot said, watching her closely, "because he was murdered last night, and in his dying moments he wrote your name." A long, heavy silence. Then Eleanor exhaled softly. "I suppose I should have expected this." She walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames as if she could see something Poirot could not. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant. "Simon Wren was not just a witness," she murmured. "He was the last piece of a puzzle that should have never been solved." Poirot stepped forward. "What did he see, Madame Fairfax?" She turned, her eyes dark with something close to regret. "He saw the truth, the one truth that was meant to stay buried." And then the lights flickered. A gunshot rang out. Poirot ducked, his heart hammering as the window behind him shattered. The shot had not been meant for him. It had been meant for Eleanor. By the time he turned, she was gone. The grand doors of the manor slammed shut. She had run. But why? Poirot exhaled slowly, piecing it together. The witness had known something that had cost him his life. And now, the only person who could tell Poirot what it was had vanished into the night. The house was still. The wind howled through the broken window. And then Poirot saw it, the one clue that changed everything. A single glove lying on the floor. Not Eleanor's. It was too large, too coarse, a man's glove. Poirot picked it up, his mind racing. Whoever had been here had not come to protect Eleanor. They had come to kill her. And now she was running from both the killer and the truth. Poirot turned sharply. This case was no longer just about murder. It was about something far bigger, something worth killing for, something that had begun long before Simon Wren had made his final call. A conspiracy, a crime forgotten by time, and someone, somewhere, was still pulling the strings. The game had changed. The real question now was not who had killed Simon Wren. The real question was, who else was supposed to die? Chapter 6. Poirot's Fatal Mistake. The night was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that made the air feel heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Poirot stood at the edge of the crime scene, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the dimly lit study. The chair was overturned. The glass of wine spilled across the carpet, and in the center of it all lay the body of Eleanor Fairfax, the woman he had sworn to protect. Her eyes were still open, frozen in an expression of shock, as if the last thing she had seen had been something she could not comprehend. Poirot knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers against the cold skin of her wrist. No pulse, no life, only death, and the echo of a mistake he could never take back. The scent of gunpowder lingered in the air, but there was no weapon, no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no broken locks. Whoever had done this had been a ghost, silent, methodical, unseen. Poirot clenched his jaw. He had miscalculated. He had believed he was in control of this case, that he was the hunter, but now he was the fool. A sound from behind, software barely audible. a whisper of fabric against wood. Poirot turned, his heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the flickering candlelight, casting shadows against the bookshelves. But something was wrong. He could feel it. The realization struck him like ice. He had made a mistake. Not just once, but from the beginning. This case, this game, had never been about finding the killer. It had been about trapping him. And he had walked straight into it. Poirot exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the armrest of the chair. Think. Eleanor had run from something, but she had not been afraid of her murderer. No, she had been afraid of him, the letter, the message from Simon Wren, the name in the asylum records, the key to a door that should not exist. It had all led back to Poirot. He looked down at Eleanor's hand. Something was clutched between her fingers, barely, visible beneath the crimson stain of her own blood. Poirot pried it free with careful precision. A torn piece of paper, its edges damp, the ink smudged but still legible. A name, his name, Hercule Poirot. He felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a stone. He had been played. Every step, every clue, every whisper in the dark had been orchestrated to lead him here, to this moment. The mistake was not missing the murderer. The mistake was thinking he wasn't the target. A chill ran down his spine, because now he knew the killer wasn't done, and the next body to fall would be his. Chapter 7. An alibi built on lies. The clock struck midnight, its chime echoing through the halls of Ashcroft Manor. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the skin and refused to let go. Poirot sat in the dimly lit study, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest of his chair. Across from him, the 5 suspects sat in a row, their expressions carefully measured, their breathing just a little too steady. They all had something in common. An alibi, a perfect one. Too perfect. The victim, Lord Edmund Ashcroft, had been found murdered in his study just hours ago. A single bullet fired from close range, the door locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. The pistol was still clutched in his hand, making it look like suicide. But it wasn't. Someone in this room had killed him, and Poirot knew that one of these alibis was a carefully constructed lie. Lady Celeste Ashcroft, the grieving widow, sat closest to the fire, her face pale, her hands trembling, just enough to appear natural. She had been in her chambers at the time of the murder, reading a letter from her late husband, but the letter had no date, no ink stains, no sign of urgency. Henry Ashcroft, the nephew, leaned back in his chair, his gaze unreadable. He had been playing cards in the parlor with 2 guests, both of whom confirmed his whereabouts. Yet, in the dim light, Poirot noticed faint traces of gunpowder on the cuffs of his sleeves. Margaret Holloway, the housekeeper, stood in the farthest corner, hands folded tightly. She swore she had been preparing Lord Ashcroft's evening tea, but when Poirot inspected the tray, the tea was still warm. Too warm. If she had made it when she claimed, it should have been cold by now. Detective Inspector Farrow had arrived minutes after the murder, yet his uniform was slightly damp, as though he had stepped out into the rain before entering the house. He claimed he had been summoned by an anonymous phone call. Poirot knew better. There had been no record of any call. And then there was Theodore Lane, the family lawyer. Calm. Too calm. He had been in his office, drafting Ashcroft's latest will. He had proof, witnesses, an unshakable alibi. And yet, Poirot's gaze lingered on the ink bottle on Theodore's desk. The cap was missing. The ink had dried at an angle, as though the bottle had been tilted mid-use, a sign that he had left his office, that he had returned later to finish writing. A mistake, a small one. But in a case like this, a single mistake was all Poirot needed. The room was silent. The only sound was the slow, deliberate ticking of the grandfather clock. Poirot stood, his shadow stretching long against the walls. "The truth," he said softly, "has a way of revealing itself." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single object, a scrap of paper, a torn corner from the very will that Theodore Lane had supposedly written, uninterrupted in his office, a corner stained with blood. For the first time that evening, Theodore's mask cracked, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear. Poirot stepped forward. "Monsieur Lane," he whispered, "would you care to explain why a piece of your perfectly typed will was found beside Lord Ashcroft's body?" A breath, a heartbeat of silence. And then Theodore ran. A sharp crash. The chair toppled over. Footsteps pounded against the marble floors as Theodore bolted toward the corridor. The others gasped, frozen in their seats, but Poirot did not move. He simply closed his eyes. A second later, the heavy doors swung open. Two officers stepped inside, guns raised. Theodore stopped dead in his tracks. Checkmate. The housekeeper let out a sharp breath. Henry Ashcroft looked away. Lady Celeste's trembling hands finally stilled. Poirot turned, his voice a whisper, but every word razor-sharp. "You built your alibi on lies, Monsieur Lane, but a lie, no matter how well constructed, will always collapse under the weight of truth." Theodore's shoulders sagged. His breath came fast, uneven. He opened his mouth to speak. Then he smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. "You think you've won, Poirot," he murmured. "But this was never about Lord Ashcroft." Poirot frowned. The room grew colder. Theodore's smile widened. "You're chasing the wrong crime." The air shifted. A sense of something unfinished. A feeling Poirot could not shake. And then a gunshot. Loud, echoing through the halls. Not from Theodore, from another room in the house. The realization struck Poirot, too late. The murder of Lord Ashcroft had been a distraction. The real target had just been killed. And this time, Poirot had been too late to stop it. Chapter 8. The truth he swore to take to his grave. The letter arrived in the dead of night. No return address, no postmark. Just a single envelope slipped beneath Poirot's door, as if delivered by a ghost. He held it between his fingers, feeling the weight of something unspoken, something ancient. When he opened it, the paper inside was yellowed with age, the ink faded, but still legible. 4 words. "He never died, Poirot." His breath stilled. A familiar chill crept up his spine. The handwriting, it was unmistakable. He had seen it before. He had seen it years ago on case files long buried, on reports sealed away in forgotten archives. This was the handwriting of a man who had been dead for 30 years. Lord Elias Harrow. A man Poirot had investigated. A man whose body had been found in the river. A man whose death had been ruled an accident. But now someone was telling Poirot that Lord Harrow had never died at all. The next morning, Poirot stood before Harrow Manor, its towering gates rusted with time. The estate had long been abandoned, its windows dark, its halls empty. The world had forgotten it, but Poirot had not. He had been here before, all those years ago, standing in this very spot, believing a crime had been solved. Now, he wasn't so sure. He stepped inside. Dust hung in the air like whispers of the past. The grand piano in the foyer was covered in a thick sheet, untouched. The paintings on the walls were missing, leaving only empty frames, like unblinking eyes. And then, in the center of the vast drawing room, something impossible. A fresh candle, burning low. Someone had been here. Poirot's fingers curled into fists. He followed the scent of melted wax, tracing his way to the study. The door creaked open under his touch, and there, sitting at the desk, as if he had never left, was the ghost himself. A man, old, weathered, his hair white, his skin lined with years of secrets. His hands trembled as he reached for a glass of whiskey, and when he looked up, his voice was rough, like a man who had forgotten how to speak. "You shouldn't have come here, Poirot." Silence stretched between them, thick with something unsaid. Poirot did not move, did not blink. The man before him was Elias Harrow, alive, breathing, a man who had been declared dead 3 decades ago. "Why?" Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why fake your death?" A bitter laugh. Elias leaned back in his chair, the ice in his glass clinking softly. "Because the truth, mon ami, was never meant to be found." Poirot took a slow step forward. "What truth?" Elias exhaled, his fingers tightening around the glass. His eyes, once sharp, now dulled by time, locked onto Poirot's, and then at last he spoke. "The wrong man was buried in my place." Poirot's breath caught. The walls of the past began to crack, the foundation of an old case collapsing beneath him. "You mean to say—" Elias nodded. "The body they found in the river. It wasn't me." His voice dropped, lower, barely audible. "It was my brother." Poirot's stomach turned. 30 years ago, the case had been simple. A body had been discovered, washed up along the Thames, identified as Elias Harrow. But what if it had all been a lie? "What happened that night?" Poirot pressed, his voice now laced with urgency. Elias hesitated, then slowly he reached for the drawer in his desk. His hands trembled as he pulled out a single photograph. He placed it in front of Poirot, his eyes heavy with something close to regret. Poirot picked it up, and everything he thought he knew shattered. The photo was old, taken just days before Elias's supposed death. It showed 2 men, identical in every way, but one detail sent a chill through Poirot's spine. The man standing next to Elias, the man who was supposedly his brother, had a scar, a long, jagged scar running from his cheek to his jaw. Poirot knew that scar. He had seen it before, on the corpse they had buried. And then, the final, damning realization struck him like a hammer. Elias Harrow never had a brother. He had killed a man who looked like him. He had staged his own death. And for 30 years, he had lived in the shadows, letting the world believe he was dead. "Why?" Poirot whispered. "Who was he?" Elias's eyes darkened. "The only man who ever knew the truth about me." A sharp intake of breath. Poirot understood now. The wrong man had not been buried. The right one had, and Elias Harrow had killed to disappear. Poirot set the photograph down carefully. The room felt colder now, the weight of the past pressing down on him. "You swore to take this to your grave," Poirot murmured. Elias's lips curled into a sad smile. "I did." He lifted his glass. "But the dead don't stay buried forever, do they?" Poirot watched as Elias drank, his hands steady, too steady. And then he saw it. The slight tremble in Elias's fingers, the flicker of something in his eyes. Poirot's breath caught. The whiskey glass fell from Elias's grip, shattered against the desk. His body lurched forward. His lips parted, gasping for breath. Poirot rushed forward, but it was already too late. Elias Harrow slumped in his chair, his final breath escaping as a quiet sigh. Dead. Poirot's fingers found the edge of the glass. He lifted it to his nose. The scent was unmistakable. Poison. Elias had always known his past would catch up to him. And so, when it did, he chose to silence himself before the truth could escape. Poirot stood still, watching the life fade from the man who had fooled the world, the man who had outlived his own murder. But as he turned to leave, something stopped him. A whisper of a thought, a detail out of place. The letter. Someone had sent that letter. Someone had wanted Poirot to find Elias. Someone had known the truth and had forced this final confrontation. Poirot's pulse quickened. Elias Harrow was not the mastermind of this game. He had been a pawn, and the real puppeteer was still out there. Chapter 9. A secret hidden in plain sight. The rain had begun to fall again, slow at first, then harder, as if the sky itself had chosen this night to weep. Poirot stood at the entrance of Harrow Manor, his coat damp, his mind racing. The death of Elias Harrow had only deepened the mystery. He had thought the man's past was the key to it all, but Elias had been nothing more than a puppet. And somewhere in this house, the one pulling the strings was still watching, still waiting. The study was exactly as Poirot had left it. The broken whiskey glass, the poisoned drink still staining the wood of the desk. But something was wrong, something off. He could feel it. It was not the crime scene itself, nor the scent of death that lingered in the air. It was something else, something he had missed. Poirot turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shelves of books, the faded portraits, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. Then his gaze fell upon it. A painting, hung in the same place as before, but different, subtle, barely noticeable. It had been moved. His breath slowed, his pulse quickened. Poirot stepped forward, reaching out. He ran his fingers along the frame, feeling for anything unusual. Then, a click. The wall shifted. A thin sliver of air rushed through as the hidden panel slid open. A hidden door. Poirot exhaled. A secret, hidden in plain sight. Beyond the panel, a narrow passage stretched into darkness. The air was thick, heavy with dust, and something else, something old, something forgotten. Poirot stepped inside, the dim light of his pocket torch illuminating the path. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading downward, deeper beneath the house. The walls were damp stone, carved long ago. Then, a door, old, wooden, the edges rotting. Poirot's hand trembled as he reached for the handle. It was unlocked. He stepped inside. The room was small. A single table sat in the center, covered in old papers, faded photographs, and a journal. The candle, beside it, had been burning recently. Someone had been here, studying, searching for something. Poirot's fingers brushed over the journal's leather cover. He flipped it open, scanning the handwriting inside. It was a ledger, names, dates, locations, a record of transactions. Poirot's breath hitched. He recognized some of these names: aristocrats, politicians, powerful men who had been caught in scandals, blackmail, disappearances, and all of them were linked to one name. The name of a man who should not exist. The name of a man who had been erased. Poirot turned the final page, and there it was, the truth. A single photograph. He stared at it, his heartbeat slow, deliberate. A young Hercule Poirot, standing beside Elias Harrow, standing beside the man who had just died. Poirot's breath caught in his throat. He had never taken this photograph. He had never met Elias Harrow before this case. Had he? A single note was scrawled beneath the image, in the same handwriting as the ledger. You were never supposed to remember. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air too thick. Poirot staggered back. This was impossible. This was not his past. This was not his life. And yet, the evidence said otherwise. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Poirot turned sharply, his mind snapping back to the present. He had been led here. Someone had left this door unlocked. Someone had left this ledger open. Someone had wanted him to see this. And now, they were coming to finish the job. Poirot reached for his revolver. The candle flickered. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Then, a voice. Low, calm, familiar. You were never supposed to look, Poirot. The door creaked open, and in the dim light, a shadow stepped inside. The last person Poirot ever expected. The one who had been watching all along. The one who knew everything. It's time you learned the truth about yourself. And with those words, everything shattered. Chapter 10. The Final Betrayal. The door creaked open, the dim candlelight casting long, shifting shadows against the cold stone walls. Poirot stood motionless, his revolver steady, but his pulse thrumming like a war drum. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, slow, deliberate. The flickering glow illuminated their face, calm, unreadable, yet familiar, in the worst possible way. It was him. A voice, smooth as silk, cut through the silence. You were never supposed to find this place. Poirot did not lower his weapon. And yet, here I am. The man chuckled softly, almost amused. Yes, here you are. At the end of a trail you were never meant to follow. He stepped closer, the scent of old leather and something metallic clinging to the air. And now, you finally understand, don't you? Poirot's grip tightened. The photograph, the ledger, the names, everything had led here, to this moment, to him. But the truth still felt just out of reach, like a puzzle, missing its final piece. You orchestrated all of this, Poirot said, his voice even, betraying nothing. The letters, the deaths, the lies, every step, every move, leading me here. Why? The man tilted his head, as if disappointed. Come now, Poirot. You are the greatest detective of our time, and yet even now you hesitate. You ask why, when the answer is already staring at you. A pause. Poirot exhaled. His voice dropped to a whisper. Because it was always you. A slow, knowing smile spread across the man's lips. There it is. The weight of realization crashed down on Poirot like a collapsing house. His mind reeled, his breath shallow. How had he not seen it before? The clues had been there, hiding in plain sight, weaving a story more intricate than even he could have imagined. This man had always been one step ahead, because this man was Hastings. A long silence stretched between them. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling through the open passageway like the cries of the forgotten. Poirot barely found his voice. You died. Hastings chuckled again, shaking his head. Did I? His eyes darkened, sharp as a blade. You never even questioned it, did you? You accepted it as neatly as you accept every piece of the puzzles you solve. But this, he gestured to the room, to the secrets buried within. This was never a case to be solved. It was a game, Poirot, a game I played with you. Poirot's fingers twitched. His mind fought to unravel the impossible truth. Hastings had been his closest friend, his confidant, and yet this was no friend standing before him. You faked your death, Poirot murmured, the words tasting like poison. Why? Hastings sighed, almost wistful. I had to see if you would look for me. He took another step forward, his shadow stretching across the stone floor. But you didn't, did you? You moved on, solved new cases. You forgot me. Poirot's throat tightened. That is not true. Hastings' eyes gleamed. Isn't it? Tell me, Poirot, how many times did you visit my grave? How many nights did you sit and wonder if something was amiss? You are the great detective, and yet you never questioned it. You let me die because it was convenient, because the world made sense without me in it. Poirot swallowed hard, his heartbeat unsteady. I mourned you, mon ami. Hastings' expression flickered, just for a moment. Something raw, something wounded, but it was gone just as quickly. I gave you every opportunity, he whispered, stepping closer, lowering his voice to something nearly gentle. But you never looked, and so I had to bring you here. I had to make you see. Poirot stared into the face of the man he once trusted more than anyone. But this was not the Hastings he remembered. This was someone else. Someone who had waited in the shadows, carefully pulling the strings, the ledger, the false identities, the betrayals. It was never about Elias Harrow. It was never about the past. It was always about Poirot. A slow, terrible realization crept over him. You wanted me to solve this, he whispered. You wanted me to find you. And now that I have... Hastings nodded. Now, you must decide. Poirot's hand trembled. The revolver felt heavier than it ever had before. Hastings did not reach for a weapon. He simply watched, waiting. Poirot could end this now. One pull of the trigger, one bullet, one final move in a game neither of them had ever meant to play. But Hastings only smiled. Would you do it, Poirot? He murmured. Would you kill the last man who ever truly knew you? The room pulsed with silence. Poirot's breath slowed, his heartbeat steadied. And then he lowered the gun. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Hastings' face. Surprise? Amusement? Disappointment? Poirot could not tell. You still don't understand, do you? Hastings whispered. Poirot exhaled. Perhaps not, Hastings smiled. Then I suppose the game isn't over after all. The candlelight flickered, a shadow passed, and before Poirot could react, Hastings was gone. The passage stood empty. The storm outside had stopped. The silence in the manor felt suffocating. Poirot closed his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had solved the case, but he had lost something far greater. The world would never believe him, because the greatest betrayal was the one no one would ever know had happened.